Hello, everyone, and welcome to yet another exciting week with the Humanist Association of San Diego. Last week, we had Dr. Karen Stoyanov, a Unitarian Universalist minister, and in her talk, which was so wonderfully humanist, she discussed the living traditions. And also, I asked a question of what is the deeply, subversively wonderful, robust, progressive action that is needed today that the Unitarians are currently engaged with. And in both the living tradition and, according to Dr. Stoyanov, the big, bold, progressive action that Unitarians are engaging in is inclusivity. We have a lot of tribalism happening today. We have a lot of exclusion. And we can look at the major religions that are evangelical and proselytize, and their version of inclusion is assimilation. It's not necessarily inclusion. You're only included if you're one of us. Across the family and spectrum of humanity, we have a diversity of thoughts, a diversity of talents, and a diversity of abilities. And part of our humanist commitment is to be inclusive. In the process of being inclusive, especially with those who are usually not considered or are otherwise the most vulnerable people, the mere act of including people is incredibly empowering. At the start of our Sunday lecture series and speaker series, I bring up two topics to meditate on, to not just think of today, but to consider throughout the week, to consider how you can incorporate them in your own life and encourage you to include others in incorporating these two wonderful facets. And the two wonderful facets to consider today are exactly what I just mentioned. It is inclusivity and empowerment. And a group of people that usually receives very little consideration are people who are living with special needs. If we look at the CDC and the US Census, what we see is that 1 out of every 4 adults in the United States, 61 million Americans, are people who are living with special needs. And this isn't merely a factor of equal distribution. Oftentimes, certain groups like indigenous individuals tend to have a disproportionate number of those who have special needs or who are living with special needs. Additionally, when we look at wealth and income earning and the distribution of wealth and income, what we notice is that people who are living with special needs earned about less than 70% of the median earnings for those who are not living with special needs. Poverty and living with special needs might put someone at risk for not being included in society. And as humanists, we have this commitment, this strong commitment to work actively, diligently, and with a joy to make sure that people are included, because we firmly believe that there is only one life, and we are deeply committed to dignity. And to combine those together, inclusivity is necessary, as a necessary foundation of recognizing the dignity and the worth of the individual and as a member of our society. And so what I consider on this is that when we consider those who are less than considered, in most cases, we do so much for our common and shared humanity. And one other aspect of the living traditions that Dr. Stoyanov brought up was not just a duty to be inclusive, not just a duty to be loving as part of the living tradition, but also to be informed, to be informed. The Unitarian Universalists have a religious duty to be informed. And fortunately for us, someone who is the vice president of our organization, the Humanist Association of San Diego, who's also on the board of the Humanist Association of Orange County, the Anti-Defamation League of Orange County, the Orange County Alliance for Racial Equity, the Southern California Secular Coalition Leadership Committee, and in the United Nations Association of Orange County, is one individual with a personal experience as well as a professional experience. Our speaker today, who you all know and love, specialized in special needs education and is a recently retired professor of developmental and social psychology. He did his undergrad in child development and human services at CSU Fullerton, and his Master of Science and Ph.D. in developmental social psychology at the University of California, Los Angeles. He taught for more than 3 decades at the University of California, Irvine, and in the school system as a K through 12 teacher. His insights are brilliant. He's warm. He's amazing. He's one of us, and we are lucky to have him. And we all know him, so he doesn't need much further introduction because his credentials and his brilliance speak for themselves. So let's give an in-house welcome to our special guest of the day, Dr. Jeremy Cohen, as he brings us into perspectives of special needs people. Jeremy?
Thank you so much, Jason. So before I start the presentation, put up the PowerPoint slides and all, I want to let you know that to me, this is a very, very serious subject because we talk about inclusion, we talk about marginalization, we talk about having changed laws in the early 90s, the Americans with Disabilities Act. And yet we still have, like Jason said, so many people, 1 in 4 in this society are special needs on some level, and their needs aren't met. They're marginalized, they're pushed aside, they're not even looked at. So today's presentation is, you will see when I put up the PowerPoint slide that I first put this together in 1998. And this is what I would consider it's what we would call 101. It's like a very beginning introductory course to give people an understanding of what disability is and how it actually works and the different parts of what are going on. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and put this up. So you know, the thing that is significant, first of all, is that perspectives, how to take the perspective of someone who has special needs, how to look at the world through their eyes, through their lens. It's so easy for us to look at the world through our own lens because that's what we're used to doing. And to look at the world through their perception is really a lot more about understanding where are they coming from. And that's how you take their perspective. So first of all, assisting special needs individuals. That means to provide the person with the assistance or interventions necessary in order for him or her to achieve his or her goals. And those goals are going to vary, those needs are going to vary depending on who and what they are, how their disability affects them. So one thing to look at is medical treatment. And this looks at, do they need Medicare, which is federal assistance through the United States government, or do they need Medi-Cal or Medicaid, which is state assistance? Or are they going to have the ability to have insurance? Is it affordable? And mostly, is it convenient? Why do I say convenient? Because Special needs people don't always have mobility. And that means they can't just jump in a car and drive 20 miles to get to whatever. They might have to be relying on public transportation, which is limited. So there are a lot of different aspects, and that's why we must look at the individual and what their needs are. Second, I put up here housing, HUD, which is federal housing, or disabled convenient. What do I mean by disabled convenient? If someone's in a wheelchair, they need doors that are wide enough to accommodate the wheelchair. They need ramps to accommodate the wheelchair. They need a sink low enough to accommodate the fact that they're in a chair. Light switches low enough so that they can reach them. I mean, things that the average human being doesn't even think about because we just amble through our day-to-day routine and reach for what we want or climb on what we want in order to get things met, our needs met. Affordability, to have a home or a structure, a building that has a ramp and that has all the things necessary, that needs to be affordable because people who are disabled oftentimes are on a very, very strict fixed income. And I will get to that from my own personal experiences a bit later. And they also need to be close to necessities. Things like grocery shopping, things like laundry, if they don't have a laundry facility where they live. There are so many aspects to this. They need to be close to public transportation. You know, we don't want them walking 2 miles to get to the bus stop. So, and that brings up number 3, transportation. Do they, do they have access to bus service, or do they need door-to-door shuttle service? Do they need to take a taxi cab or ride share like Lyft and Uber? Do they actually have, instead of just transportation in society, do they have the needs in their own home, in their own community? A wheelchair or mobility aids, walkers, crutches, and I just put that under transportation. I mean, I could go further to talk about hearing aids, visual aids, emotional support pet, or a seeing eye dog. I mean, on and on it goes. And then education. Do they require vocational training or state rehabilitation services? Is it affordable to them? Can they get access to it? Is it something that will assist and help them? Not everybody is going to be educated the same, and we're going to talk about more of that in a bit. But they need to be given the ability to get educated so that they can at least be a self-sustaining, productive member of our society. And one of the reasons that productivity is so important has really nothing to do with earning a living as much as it has to do with self-esteem. People want to feel like they're contributing and like they're able to do for themselves. And that leads into the next thing, community. They need people to socialize with. They need friends. They also need people to help them feel important and contributing. You know, it's not just work, it's people in their community that are loving and including and caring about them, showing them empathy and respect. And as Jason said, inclusion is so important in this. And lastly, in assisting someone, the et cetera part, which is all sorts of things, in-home support, shopping, all the basic activities of daily living requirements. Something as simple as making a cup of coffee. If you've ever been around someone who is visually impaired and you watch how they actually work in their kitchen, how they take a pot, put their hand in the pot as they're filling the water into it so they can feel when the water gets to a certain level, then how they feel their way over to the stove and they turn on the stove, and all the different pieces, how they feel their way through the cabinets to find whether it's tea, whether it's coffee, same thing, going into the refrigerator. Things have to be marked so that they know. And when I say marked, I don't mean with a piece of tape and written on. They have to be brailled and stuck on, let's say, a can of soda or a carton of orange juice, whatever it is, so that they know what they're grabbing. So ultimately, when assisting a special needs person, we have to look at and include all of the dimensions and components that constitute and define his or her life experience. Now, that's a lot of words. Dimensions, components, constitute, define. What we're getting at here is that, again, it's that perspective taking. We have to look at every aspect of that person's life. If they're visually impaired, how are they going to get down the street? How are they going to get to where they need to go? If there's someone in a wheelchair, how are they going to get to where they need to go? How are they going to get through the grocery store and get the things off the shelves? If they have limited mobility, or if they have limited functionality of their hands, of the ability to grab. These are huge, huge issues for someone who has a disability, because, again, the general public, we don't even have a comprehension of what it really means to live life through their perspective. So going on, I've broken this up into different models. This is an ecological model. People are made up of many components. Biologically, the physical traits and aspects that make up the person, what we see and know to be the organic causes that constitute and define a disability. And when I say organic causes, I also mean mental disabilities, because there's organic problems. It has to do with chemical imbalance. It has to do with wiring that isn't working properly in the neurological system. So biological does include people who have mental or emotional disabilities. Psychological, the behaviors, opinions, and feelings that the person expresses and displays due to his or her experiences as a member of society. How the person feels about him or herself and others, and how he or she acts toward him or herself and others based on current and past experiences that are a result of the biological, sociological, and anthropological components that are and have been present in a person's life. Now, this sounds a bit complicated. What is being said here is that how I feel about myself oftentimes has a lot to do with how I perceive someone else treating me. If someone else ostracizes me, or ignores me, or pushes me over to the side, or doesn't even acknowledge that I'm existent, that's going to have an emotional effect on me. Or the same thing, if someone shows me love and concern and caring and wants to assist me, that's also going to affect my psychological output. Am I going to be more loving and caring as an individual because someone is showing me that kind of behavior? And we will talk about that more. Third, sociological, the overall disposition that the person has developed because of how society has interacted with him or her. Has he or she been isolated, treated with indifference, avoided, ostracized, made to feel worthless, subhuman, etc.? This is touching on human rights, that people are people and need to be treated as people with a set of dignity and human rights and integrity. And that is very important in the sociological makeup, which ultimately affects the psychological makeup, not only of the person, but of the overall society. Anthropological, the manner in which the person expresses him or herself in relation to and resulting from the cultural attitudes and behaviors that have been expressed and directed toward him or her from the predominant and prevailing culture present in the immediate environment. That is essentially, that number 4 is what my PhD was on, how social attitudes affect social competency in disabled people. In other words, if society's cultural attitudes and behaviors, they have a direct effect on how a person is going to develop and how they're going to be able to navigate and negotiate. If they are ostracized, they're going to withdraw into themselves. If they're accepted and embraced, they're going to be more likely to want to share who and what they are with the majority of our society. Lastly, on this page, this model indicates all components and dimensions of the person and his or her environment are interconnected. When we are consistent in our views and approaches to every facet that make up the person, as shown above, and simultaneously address the person's issues and concern from his or her many perspectives, we will then be better equipped to understand the person and thus better able to be inclusive and communicate to assist him or her. So again, we're looking at taking all aspects of that person into account, but also communicating with them openly and honestly, and trying to understand the world from their perspective, not from our own perspective, because our perspective is based on our own experiences, not on theirs. And even if we're someone who has had a disability or been around people with disability, or even work with people with disabilities, we still have our own perspective. And part of the trick, and I call it a trick because it's the work of taking the time to find out what is that person's true perspective so that we know how to address things from their viewpoint. Going on to this next slide has to do with socialization factors. Depending on how the person has been socialized into our society will determine his or her ability or inability and desire or reluctance as to whether or not he or she is receptive or resistant to accepting help and assistance from you. Now, this was touching on what I said about, how social attitudes affect social competency. If when the person has been ostracized, he or she might not feel worthy of help or assistance. If that person has been isolated, he or she might not know how to effectively communicate because that's never been demonstrated. The same thing with if they're ostracized, they've been pushed away, they're not going to feel worthy because they've already been given the message that they're not worthy, they're subhuman, they're not an integral part of our society. If the person does not know how to effectively communicate, he or she might not understand the verbal and nonverbal cues and subtleties associated with social communication. Therefore, this might result in an inability to socially function, based on a lack of information regarding what social norms and standards are currently in practice, and in what situations it is relevant to apply those behaviors. In the case of someone who, let's say, is autistic, the way that person is biologically wired, they don't pick up social cues because that part of their brain is not processing that information because it doesn't work right. And so they don't pick up on social cues. And it doesn't mean they're not a person with feelings. It just means they don't pick up on those cues. Well, I'm saying also that it happens to people with many different disabilities, because if they've been pushed away and they've never learned that effective communication, they don't know how. They've never been shown what to do. They've never witnessed appropriate or pro-social, as we call it, positive interactions with other human beings. If the person has been treated with disrespect, he or she might not trust. If they've been treated as worthless, they might not have any self-esteem. If they've been treated as incapable, not capable, they might not have the courage to take risks because they've always been told, oh, you can't do this, so why even try? And I know there are people on this chat who've expressed that that has happened to them. And that is significant, telling them, oh, you'll never amount to nothing, so don't even try. Not a very inclusive, positive, loving way to do anything. So moving on, perspective taking. The only way to assist a special needs person is to try to understand where he or she is coming from and what his or her experiences have been. Try to put yourself into that person's shoes and experience his or her world as he or she truly experiences it. Try to understand his or her feelings, frustrations, daily experiences, and all of the cascade effects based on the intricacies of his or her disability. An easy way to do this is walk around with earmuffs on and hear nothing, walk around with a blindfold on and see nothing, sit in a wheelchair and try to maneuver yourself up and down the street and into buildings. You will be amazed at the level of frustration and feelings that you'll experience. And it's not just because the door is too small or the curb doesn't have a driveway. It can be the way people look at you, the way they rush in front of you and don't hold the door for you, or the way they even make snide comments under their mouth, because under their breath, because you're taking too long to maneuver. You'd be very surprised if you take the time to observe what goes on and really sit there and sit in those feelings and realize what is going on emotionally. Like yourself, this person is a complex individual, and they're not made up of just one component. And one of the things that's so very important, he or she is not his or her disability. His or her disability is just one component of who or he or she really are. And that component is not the most prevalent one. It's just a piece. When we interact with a disabled person, we must try to take into account the totality of who he or she really is and appreciate and learn from his or her unique experiences. People with disabilities have insights that most of us can't even begin to comprehend. And so moving on, working with special needs individuals. This is a very, very, very complex issue because each one is so unique. Each person is such a unique individual. And then on top of it, and I'm just talking about people in general, and then you put a disability in that mix as well, it gets even more complicated. If a young child is the person you want to work with, you got to establish firm boundaries, yet always reflect empathy and concern. Defer to the person who's with them, their aide or personal helper, to guide you as they are familiar with that child. And that's assuming that that person has someone to help them. That also might be a parent or an adult guardian or an older sibling. So, we have to tread carefully because we don't know. But we must establish boundaries. And the reason I say that is because young kids, they figure out pretty early on that they're different and they have a disability. And like all children, they will manipulate to get what they want. Well, disabled children get really good at it really fast because they figure out that I can't do certain things, so I'll manipulate you to get what I want. And some of that is what we call learned helplessness, because in their family of origin, they're taught, oh, well, mommy or daddy will come and take care of it, so you don't have to do anything. Well, that's doing them a disservice because ultimately, they have to learn how to take care of themselves. At some point, they're going to have to negotiate life. And so it's more important to teach them how not to be helpless, but how to be a warrior. And you have to do that with compassion and empathy and consideration and caring, and mostly love. If a mature individual, if that's who you're working with, you have to ask them, what is it that they require from you? What assistance do they need? If they're non-communicative, ask them how they prefer to communicate with you. Oftentimes, people who are deaf, they'll give you a card and tell you, so you have to write things down. Or someone who's blind, you spell it out on their hand. You actually literally spell out letters on their hand. If someone who is autistic or Down syndrome, you use emojis. You help communicate with pictures. So again, it means a willingness to open your own mind up to there's more than one way to communicate. And we've all seen recently in the last, many years, how there have been people who have been shot to death by police because they had a physical disability, like they couldn't hear, and they didn't comply with the commands, or they had autism and they didn't comply with the commands. And hello, the police are clearly not trained. how to understand that this community has special needs. Another one, always be respectful and show caring and concern, empathy and affection, and be inclusive. Always be inclusive and let them know you care about them as an individual. Treat them as you would want to be treated and show understanding. Show love. It doesn't hurt. And also try not to be offended or dismayed by physical appearance or inappropriate behaviors. Be patient and compassionate and show a genuine willingness and be open-minded. If someone has a strange look, a screwed up face, whatever you want to label it, or they're making comments inappropriately or mumbling, or whatever the case may be, don't become offended. I mean, yeah, it's easy to personalize. Oh, I'm standing next to this person. Everybody is in line is looking at me, or everybody sees me and they're assuming something about me. Who cares what they think? Who cares what they're assuming? You know, the point is if you show compassion and caring and consideration to the person, you're actually stepping above. You're showing the maturity and the necessity of being humanist and of showing how important it is to be inclusive and care about another person in our society. And our last slide has some discussion questions. So Jason, I'm going to throw it back to you.
Sure. Jeremy, thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I know that after this, I have a number of questions. I know other people have a number of questions as well. So firstly, what are ways one can open a dialogue with a special needs individual?
A great question. And a simple way is to introduce yourself, just like you would with another human being. Don't treat them any differently. Like I said, don't give them the option of learned helplessness. Don't give them the option of sinking into themselves, which means receding and hiding in plain sight. Just go up to them and ask them, what's your name? Why are you here? What's going on? And you know, dialogue with them. Talk to them about, you know, who they are, and don't just focus on their disability, but encourage them that it's safe to talk to you. You know, you can say to them, I noticed there's something, you know, different. Do you care to talk about it, or is that me overstepping a boundary? I mean, that way you're showing them respect and consideration at the same time, and you're loving on them. Just by the fact that you're willing to talk to them is already going to make them smile, because they're going to be like, wow, a human being who's not afraid of me. So that's a good answer to number one.
Okay. Number two, how does one know what boundaries are appropriate with special needs people?
If the person is communicative, ask them. If not, if the person doesn't articulate, if they have someone with them, whether it's a parent or a caregiver, ask that caregiver, make conversation, ask them, you know, say, you know, is it okay for me to talk to this person? What is their name? And you know, find out, you know, is it okay for me? And the reason I put that word boundaries in is because I'm giving a very specific. When you're dealing with someone who, let's say, is visually impaired and they have a seeing eye dog, if that dog is in a harness and has a vest that actually communicates on it that they are a special needs animal, that they're working, that also is the signal you are not supposed to interact with that dog. In other words, we don't come up and, oh, let's pet puppy. No. If that dog is working, that's a boundary. That dog needs to be working while they're harnessed, while they're in their vest. And what does working mean? It doesn't just mean seeing for the person. It means that the person and the dog are actually, they're communicating through body language. That harness, the person holding it can feel, unlike a leash, they can feel every single vibration that comes from that animal. They can feel if the animal is tensing. They can feel if the dog is pulling in a direction. They communicate without language, nonverbal language. And so the boundary when that dog is there is don't touch the dog, engage the person and ask the person, is it okay if I address your dog, or is it okay I address you? Or so that's what I mean when I say boundaries. One has to understand that there is appropriateness and there is a lack of appropriateness. And so always the best way to find out is to ask the person. And if they can't communicate that to you, ask someone who they're with. And if not, just stand there and ask them who they are. Just try to give them their space and see how they respond to you. So going on.
Number 3, if a special needs person is nonverbal, how does one communicate with him or her?
I mentioned it a little bit earlier, emojis. Most of you know that you have 1,000 emojis on your phone. Well, I have news for you. This was not invented by Sony or the Japanese or Apple. This was actually invented in special needs classrooms over 25 years ago, about 35 years ago now. What occurred was, dealing with autistic and Down syndrome children who didn't communicate verbally, we would see them come into the room and we would not understand what is their emotional status for the day. So what we started doing, very basically, on a piece of paper with a Sharpie, we would draw a happy face, we would draw a sad face, we would draw a grimace. And then we started getting more advanced, in which we started taking that same image, making it smaller, like the size of maybe a good sized coin, a big, like 3 times the size of a silver dollar. And we would put the different faces on it, we would color it, and we would laminate it, and we would put it on a chart, literally an easel, and we'd have all these different emojis, these different faces. And then we would take a circular ring, and what we would do is we would have the child, as they would come into the classroom each day, take the ring and put it over the emoji, the image that you're feeling. So this morning I'm feeling happy, this morning I'm feeling frustrated, this morning I'm feeling sad, whatever. And that was how we started communicating with them. And what we did is we even advanced it more to the point where we made booklets, actual little booklets with a ring binder that had different, emojis, different pictures of emotions. And what we would do is we would put it on the child's desk. And so when they came in, the first thing they would do after they put their backpack down is they would grab that, sit at their desk, and hold it to the picture that they wanted, so that the teacher and the aides and the other kids in the classroom could see, okay, so, Jason is having a good day, or Michelle is having a mediocre day, or, so-and-so is feeling a bit upset, whatever, or tired. And this way we were learning how to communicate non-verbally with them. And we would use these throughout the day, because emotions change throughout the day. I mean, every single one of us on this call knows we might wake up happy, and within 4 hours, we're pissed at the world because something occurred. We had a bad phone call, whatever the case might be. So when dealing with someone in public, if you don't have pictures, well, most of us now have emojis on our phone. So that's one way you can communicate with them. Or you can ask them, may I draw a picture on your hand? And I don't mean with a marker, I mean with your finger, draw a circle. And while you're drawing the circles, say, I'm drawing a face. Are you feeling happy? Are you feeling sad? And, you can do basic communication with someone. And the reason that's so important is because it breaks the ice. It lets them know that you are making an attempt. And making that little attempt, guess what? They'll respond back. They'll try even harder to communicate with you because they see you're making an effort and taking an interest. So I hope that answers question 3.
Number 4, what does one do if a special needs person's behaviors are embarrassing?
Well, I kind of went touched on that a little before. Don't personalize. That's the most important thing. When someone misbehaves or someone, and when I say someone, I mean, if you have your own child in public, your toddler or your 3-year-old, whatever, or even your teenager, and they're misbehaving, they're talking back, you have the choice as the grown-up to either become embarrassed and personalize it and think, oh, this is a direct reflection of me, or you have the ability to say, wait a minute, this is a unique individual who I have absolutely nothing, their behavior has nothing to do with me whatsoever. Well, that also applies to someone with special needs. If they're doing something, like blurting out words or expletives or scratching themselves inappropriately, or even they didn't they didn't bathe and they smell. Instead of becoming embarrassed, take the time to realize, I'm not this person's keeper. I'm just another person. And if I get embarrassed and shy away, I'm just ostracizing them. I'm not being inclusive. I'm not being loving. So if they're behaving in a way that's weird, don't personalize it. Try to break through the barriers. It's never a good idea to try to tell someone they're behaving wrong or bad or try to correct them. They don't need you to be a parent. What they need is just for you to be understanding and say, and oftentimes what you can say or what you can do is redirect them to something else. If they're, saying something bizarre, ask them a question to get them to another answer, to a different place, to a different thinking. Something as simple as, so how did you get here today? Or, are you enjoying yourself while you're here? Engage them, but redirect them. It works marvelous with children. It works marvelous with adults too. So going on.
Number 5, what does one do if a special needs person's behaviors are disruptive?
This is a very important and excellent question. First of all, never put your hands on the person and try to remove them. Unless you're their personal caregiver, you don't have the legal right or foundation to remove them from a situation. What you do again is you try to redirect them. If they're disruptive, you try your best to calm them, talk to them soothingly. And the reason I say soothingly is because if you get angry, if you get emotional, they're going to feed off of the energy you're giving them. If you remain calm and polite and just easygoing, just that in and of itself might be enough to tone them down, to bring them back to reality, to make them feel like, oh, okay, this isn't as bad as I thought. This often happens with people who have Asperger's or autism, that they get overstimulated. And what do I mean when I say overstimulated? I mean just the energy in a room. Too many people talking, too many people laughing, too much visual stimulus, too many people moving around, too many questions, too much dialogue. It becomes so overwhelming because, again, their brain doesn't have the ability to process all of that emotional energy. I mean, think about it in and of yourself. When you have been at the end of a very hard day and you're tired, the last thing you want is to be bombarded with all this energy, all these questions, all this stimulation. All you want is to go sit on the couch and block everything out. Well, it's the same thing with some people with special needs, that you got to facilitate keeping them in a calm environment. And so that might be the case of asking people around them, can you kind of just tone it down a bit and try to facilitate them feeling comfortable, because that is why the person's behaviors become disruptive, is because they're being pulled out of their comfort zone. And their comfort zone oftentimes is a lot more narrow and limited than yours, because they can't handle all that stimulation. So I hope that helps to clarify.
Lastly, how can one get involved with organizations that assist special needs people?
another great question, really easily. There are different organizations in the world, such as ARC. There are other organizations that are in the phone book, are with different health providers, different community centers. For instance, the Jewish Family Services or Catholic Charities, or even the Boys and Girls Clubs, the YMCA. Many of these organizations can point you in the direction of other organizations that deal very, very specifically with people who have special needs. And they can provide not only training, but different ways of communicating, different ways to be supportive, to help financially, to help emotionally, to just help in the community. And the other thing I want you to think about, it's not just how we can help the disabled. It also, a lot of it has to do with seniors, because we have a huge amount of people in our society that started out as you and me, a normal human being. And as they age, they become disabled. They become cognitively disabled. They become physically disabled. They become emotionally stunted because they don't communicate effectively anymore. But they're still human beings, and they're still, and I'm going to use some very specific words, entitled. And I don't mean that in the sense of entitlement. I mean entitled to love, respect, dignity, caring, compassion, empathy. They are entitled to be treated like a human being with love and respect. And so there are so many different places you can find this information. Also, even schools, if you have kids in schools, the schools have contacts with organizations that work with different age groups that have it. Even at colleges, for anybody here who's a college student, there's something called the Disabled Student Center on every single campus in this country, because that was mandated by federal law. So, and these centers give appropriate accommodations to help with an individual's disability. You can't just go in there and say, oh, I'm disabled. You got to bring medical proof. You got to show them that you have a legitimate disability. But there is a lot of help out there. It's just a matter of connecting people together with it. And what I'm going to do to finish is before I open this up to general questions, is I'm going to give you a little bit more background. I'm sitting here talking to you, and I seem like, yeah, an average person, someone who can articulate well. I didn't start off that way. I started off having epileptic seizures when I was a child. And the thing is, what happened was, by the time I was in elementary school, I was having maybe 4 or 5 seizures a month. Every kid I knew I had them, and I was ostracized. There was no help. Back when I was in elementary school, back in the 60s, and there was no help. There was no one there to do anything to provide assistance. So I had to tough it out. I was ostracized. I was alone. And the thing that made that part so helpful, my mother was a registered nurse practitioner. And what she did is she told me, you will not use your disability as an excuse. She threw it in my face. And it was the best thing she ever did, because she taught me from a very young age, you will not learn helplessness. You will stand on your own 2 feet and you will make something happen, because no one's going to do it for you. She gave me at a very young age the tools. And as I got older, when I got into high school, I was horribly ostracized, because kids I didn't even know would see me walking down the hallway. They would turn and walk the other direction. Think of what that's like when you're at 15 and 16 and you're looking for your peers to accept you. I mean, that's what going through, separation and individuation into adulthood is all about. and you're just pushed away and ostracized and isolated. So I didn't even complete high school. I took a California proficiency exam, got out 1 month into my 10th grade year, didn't even complete it, went straight into junior college, or what would be called community college now, and worked my way up. And I started as a teacher with regular ed for just a very short while. Then I went into special education, working with K through 6. And because the laws were so screwed up, and in fact, there weren't laws, in other words, there was nothing there to help, I went back and I did my Ph.D. and my area was how social attitudes affect social competency. And once I did that, I was starting to teach on the university campus at UCI, University of California, Irvine, and I taught teachers and social workers how to work with people with special needs. And but I felt those things as a child growing up. I felt the ostracization. I felt the inability to adequately communicate, that no one understood me. No one could deal with my issues. And the thing is, for me, I was very fortunate because I had a lot of strong adults in my world who guided me, predominantly my mom. And the strongest part about that is when I was 16, I figured it out. And what do I mean by it? At first, I thought there was something wrong with me. Then I thought that people didn't know how to deal with me. And then I realized it's not those at all. It's that people don't know how to deal with themselves and their own emotions. At that point, I hit the nail on the head. I didn't just hit the nail into the wood, I hit it through the wood, out the other side, and it's still moving its way around the universe. My point is I figured out, why would I take on responsibility for someone else's emotional constraints? If they're constraining themselves because they feel emotionally uncomfortable because of my presence, that's their problem. That's not my problem. And that's why I was able to work with special needs people and understand things from their perspectives, because I lived it. And I realized that inclusion and acceptance and compassion and love of these people is so significant that you'd be surprised. If you find out what they're good at and you hone those skills, you'd be surprised what they're capable of. Some of them are smarter than you can possibly ever even comprehend, because they see things in ways that the rest of us just don't. So I thank you so much for the time and the energy, and for wanting to be a part of this and listen to this, especially about how to make this inclusive and how to be accepting of different people in our society, because they are, after all, human beings. And I know Jason has some questions and other people have them as well.
Well, since I asked the stated questions, I don't want to hog the questions right now. I'll ask mine in a little bit, but I'd like to open the floor for questions. Please use the raise your hand feature or type in the chat that you have a question, and I will list you accordingly. And I know that Esther has a question. Esther?
Hi. So my one of my questions is, occasionally I will do what I call day work, which is where I'm hired privately to come in and help families either with disabled adults or people that take care of their parents or whatnot and stuff like that. How do you, like, I've noticed this especially with the ones that with children and stuff, and how can I express like what you were saying about not gosh darn it, not like babying them, I guess.
Okay.
Right? Making them more independent, right? Because I've noticed like a lot of parents, they have very strict instructions on how to take care of their children, which I always follow through on, right? But I've noticed like a lot of them, they don't teach them like, you have to don't teach them how to maybe dress themselves, or put on their own socks and stuff like that. So my question would be like, how would I bring that up to them without seeming like calling them bad parents? Which they're
Well,
not. I mean, they're obviously taking care of their children, but I mean, I don't want to seem like I'm coming across as like judging them.
well, very, very good questions, Esther. One of the things that I would always suggest as a first and foremost is talk to the parent, but
Right.
pull them aside gently, especially without the child or children present if possible,
Mm-hmm.
and tell them that you have a concern and do it in a loving way. You know, you say to them, look, I'm not saying this to be judgmental. I'm not saying this because I want to be critical of you. None of those things. That's not my intention. My
Right.
intention is coming from a loving place of caring and concern. And I just wanted to ask you, when your child, you know, is getting ready in the morning, or when you're helping your child get ready in the morning, yeah, do you know how they dress themselves? Have you gone through any process with them of explaining to them how to dress themselves? And if they try to get upset with you, say, I'm just asking this out of curiosity and concern, because I've seen sometimes they're a little disheveled, and I know that makes them uncomfortable because their socks aren't on their feet right, or their clothing isn't, you know, it just makes them uncomfortable. Don't make it about, oh, they don't look appropriate, because
Right.
that's the sign where the parent attacks you. That's where the parent
Exactly.
goes,
Right.
you're judging me. But if you make it about the child, if you say, oh, well, they look like they might be uncomfortable, and then you can even segue and say, well, would you mind if I actually maybe go over some of these things with them when they're with me? Like show them,
Mm-hmm.
this is the way we put on socks, or this is the way I put on my shirt, or this is, and you don't have to necessarily do that physically with them on their body. You just wear your t-shirt and you put on a shirt on top of it and show them, this is how you put it on, this is how you button it, this is how you put on your socks. You demonstrate, and you do it slowly and lovingly, and you in some ways you try to circumvent the parent. And I know that
Mm-hmm.
doesn't sound very nice, but sometimes that's what you have to do. And believe it or not, the kid will respond to you though, because you can make it a game, you
Right.
know. And so I hope that it kind of answers the question without, you know, embarrassing the heck out of the parent.
Yes, it does. It does. Thank you.
You're welcome. So Zem, I believe you're up next.
Even though I
Yes.
haven't
There
had
you
that
go.
kind of job in a
Here we
while.
go.
That actually was.
Go ahead, Zem.
I have a question that sort of relates to question number one about initiating a dialogue. I
Yes.
wonder what you do in situations where the child or the disabled person generally doesn't want to talk to you for a number of reasons. They maybe don't even know they have a disability, or they know it, but they're really embarrassed about it, you know, and they sort of refuse to acknowledge it. Or, you know, they're just afraid. If they talk to you, I mean, who knows what's going to happen? What are you going to do to them, right? How do you
Yes.
deal with these situations?
Well, that's a great question, Zem. And what I would do in that situation is, again, you approach them and you ask them, is it okay if I talk to you? And if they shy away from you, you maybe ask again more gently. But by the second time, if you've asked and they're still withdrawing or pulling away, then you let go of it, because you know at that point you're already approaching the boundary. You're already pushing on the wall that's there, the boundary. And so because you don't want to make them feel just any kind of discomfort or uncomfortable, you know, and we're talking about in any kind of situation where, of course, they're not in danger. I mean, of course, something changes if there's a fire in the building or if there's a danger. Yes, you intercede, but in most cases, yeah, you just kind of feel out, and if they don't want to communicate, you don't push it any further. You just you could even make a comment to them, say, well, I really wanted to know who you are, and you know, you seem like such an interesting person, but since you don't want to open up or share with me, I just wish you to have a good day, and I hope you're okay, and you just go about your business. You know, but
What
you
about if
always
the
remain.
parents insist? You know, the
Well,
parents insist and tell you there's something wrong with my child, right? So you kind of have to deal with them too, right?
yeah. Well, and you do the same thing, like I told Esther. You manipulate your conversation with the parents in such a way that you tell them, okay, I will try and I'll do the best I can, but we're going to do what we can. You don't give them false expectations or false hope. You don't, okay, sure. I mean, I don't know how many times, because I've got the specialty and the credential behind it. People, can't you fix my kid, or can't you make my kid do this? And it's like, no, I can't. I mean, a lot of it has to do with your kid. Will your kid be open to dealing with me? And so that's why I oftentimes try things like, especially with a child's Zen, I'll get down on their level. If I'm going to deal with a 5-year-old or a 7-year-old, I get down on my knees. I look them straight in the face, and if they turn away from me, I might say, "Oh, I'm sorry. Did I embarrass you? Because like you're scaring me too." I said, I didn't think I was scaring you. And you hear how my voice changed, how I got soft and considerate and caring. I mean, a lot of it just has to do with that, again, perception. What is going on in the environment? What's the child emitting as energy to you? But also, what is the parent emitting as interest, as energy to you? Is the parent hovering? Are they helicoptering? Do they got that look on their face like, get it done? I mean, there's so many factors that fly in there, and this is why it's never an easy situation. So I hope that kind of clarifies.
It does. It does. Thanks. You're the expert.
There is no such thing. I mean, it's an evolving thing all the time, and we're always learning new things about people. But I see that,
Jeremy
yeah,
Jeremy J has a question. He's asking
cool.
you to explain the difference in perspectives between accepting one's disability and the efforts to reduce a disability.
Okay. Well, when we talk about accepting one's disability, acceptance for the individual means coming to terms with, my body doesn't do what I want it to do, or my brain doesn't do what I want it to do, or some part of me doesn't do what I want it to do. And I just have to be accepting of that as part of who I am. That's a perspective about accepting one's disability. The efforts to reduce disability, it's really, you can't reduce a disability as much as what you're doing is you're reducing the problems, the impediments is the best way to say it. The impediments that get in the way, that make the disability that much more profound. And a good way for me to explain that, Jeremy, would be to give you my own experiences. So because I had epileptic seizures, I wasn't allowed to drive. I grew up in Southern California. You can't live here without the ability to drive. I mean, public transportation is for shit. So, and it stops too early, so you don't have a nightlife. For me, to go grocery shopping, living on my own, going grocery shopping, having to carry my groceries to the bus stop, then have to go from the bus stop to another bus stop, because I had to take 2 buses to get where I was going. If I bought ice cream and one bus was late and I missed it, I had soup by the time I got home. This is frustrating. This doesn't work. So, or when one wants to go out, like friends would say, meet us for pizza. But the bus stopped running at 6 o'clock at night and no one can come and get you. And so again, you're kind of stuck and you feel ostracized. So the efforts to reduce disability, the myriad of perspectives is, there's so much emotional frustration to reduce or to keep the impediments from being part of the disability itself, that there's a lot of, you learn to not only rely on yourself, but you also learn to in a lot of ways you shut down, you shut things out. It's like Zem was bringing up, what if they won't communicate with you? You shut things out, you push things away, and you do that as a self-protective device because you've been set up so many times for a failure, you don't want it anymore. So oftentimes, accepting one's disability is kind of it ties into reducing the impediments of disability, in that one becomes more accepting of their own situation, and they just learn how to cope and negotiate. And there's a lot of frustration in there. There's a lot of anger. And sometimes that anger bubbles up and it seems seething. And there's very little we can do. And that's why I keep focusing on love, compassion, caring, consideration, inclusion, because at least if that person feels, I'll make it first person. If I felt that someone cared about me and wanted to assist me, I was more likely to open up to them. If I felt that they were just kind of there, I was like, okay, fine, you're there, and I don't care. I built walls. I built huge walls to protect myself. And so I hope that kind of answers the question. I know it's a roundabout, circuitous kind of answer, because to accept something about yourself, but to negotiate through life dealing with it, are similar, but they're also very different. So next is Michelle.
Hey, Jeremy, thank you so much for the talk. It's such an important subject, and I really appreciate you sharing it with us. I have a question for you about policy. You were on this amazing journey in your life to change the education system to be more inclusive to children who were differently abled. Was there a moment that you saw the education system shift? I was in school in K through 12 in the 80s, and it was not a pretty place for people who were differently abled. And so, was there a moment where you saw that shift throughout what you were doing? And then the follow-up question to that is, what's the next step? What can society, what can we do, what can I do towards creating that equitable society for people who are differently abled?
Thank you so much. Both excellent, excellent questions. The shift for me started in the late 80s and early 90s. And that shift was, just to give you the background. So I started as a special needs teacher with little ones in the mid to late 70s. And it was, for lack of a better word, fucked up. It was bad, like you're saying, Michelle. It was really, really bad. There was no help, no aids, no help. Kids were everywhere. I can remember the first class I had was kinder through third grade, and I had 15 kids and no aid. And I'd have to take some of them to the bathroom and potty them myself. And that doesn't just mean, standing in front of a stall. It means wiping up, number two. It means putting on a diaper. It means cleaning them up. It's an involved process. And if I'm taking 3 or 4 kids, I'm gone for 30 minutes. And while I'm gone, there's no one in that classroom but the kids. There's no adult in there. And I'm just going, oh my goodness, what happens if so-and-so stabs such and such with a pencil in the eye? This is liabilities, galore. And so I would whine and complain, and nothing changed until I was convinced, go back. I did my Ph.D. And upon doing that, I was able to go first to the state of California, and then the opposite. I went first to the federal government, to the National Education Association. I got them to help me, to sponsor me. And then I went to the Secretary of Education and literally had what you would call hearings in chambers in Congress, in which with senators and congressmen, showing them how there are different ways we can do things based on new research. And that was research that I had done. And so we started instituting the changing of getting the Americans with Disabilities Act changed. Then I did the same thing in the state of California at Sacramento. And as we started changing the laws, then we had to implement them. And where I saw the most profound change was when those laws started changing in Sacramento. The ADA had already been passed. And then in the early 90s in Sacramento was when we got that established at the state capitol. And I came back to the county of Orange, where I live, and sat down with different superintendents at the county board of education. So the lead superintendent and superintendents of different school districts. And the fun part for me, and it was probably that moment, was when I was sitting across from my own superintendent, who used to be my boss when I was an elementary school teacher. And I'm basically looking at them, telling them, well, this is AB such and such, state of California such and such. This has been enacted into law, and this is now what the law says. And this is what reasonable accommodations under the law look like. This is what you need to provide students with which is called reasonable accommodations. This is how many are going to be in a class size. This is how many are going to get aides. This is how many aides you're going to have. This is how many, you're going to have. Instead of every kid in the room at the same time, you're going to have, moderate to severe, or I should say severe in one room, moderate to medium in another, behavioral disorders in a third. And you're also going to have full inclusion, meaning that there's going to be something called RSP, resource specialists, who will pull kids out and give them specified training, because they will need certain things. Like this one might be a third grader, but they're doing fifth grade math or seventh grade math. They need to be given that. Or this one might be a fifth grader and can't even read a kindergarten book, so they need to read at a certain level, and we're going to get that done. And that was also in lieu of, at the same time, creating what's known as an IEP, an individual educational plan, which teachers hate. Yes, Mick Rabin is shaking his head. He knows what I'm saying. He hates it because there are a lot of paperwork. It's a lot of work, but it's necessary, because what it does is it spells out, not just for the teacher, but for the aides, for the parents, for the school district, for the legal representatives, that these are the accommodations that are going to be provided. And if they're not, then someone is in violation of the law, and there will be a consequence for this violation. So that's when I started seeing, to answer the first part of your question, that's when I started seeing real change, was in the early 90s, was when we literally started reducing class sizes, getting aides into rooms, getting kids the proper help they needed. And mostly what my pet project was in all of that was the buddy system, where we would hook up a, let's say a first grader that had autism with a first, second, or third grader who was, for lack of a better word, just an average normal kid, non-disabled kid. And we would have them, maneuver around with each other in school. They would go to the library with each other. They would go to lunch together. They would go on the playground together. And so what we did is, it was not only a sense of protection, but it was also a sense of inclusion, that, oh, the regular ed kids play with the special needs kids, and vice versa. And the regular ed kid would introduce the special needs child, and vice versa. And that there would be this interaction, so that all of a sudden we're normalizing, or at least attempting to normalize. And the real wording is, this population is here to stay. They're not going away. So you better get used to it. You regular ed kids better get used to the fact that these kids are going to be on this campus, and you're going to have to deal with it. And so by breaking down the barriers at the youngest of ages, as the kids get older and get into places like high school, like I said, they would turn around and walk away. Now it's more inclusive. They see each other, and they love on each other. And just a little bit of an anecdote. This happened recently here in Huntington Beach, where I live, about 2 years ago. The captain of the water polo and football team was leaving school, and he saw a special needs kid getting roughed up by another kid. So he stopped and he went, well, wait a minute. I've been taught, my parents have taught me what's appropriate. So he walked up to the kid who was doing the bullying and told him to knock it off. The kid didn't knock it off. he slugged him. And he got suspended from the school. And this made the papers, and several of us, me included, made contact not only with the school district, but through, legal channels. And we basically told the principal, we don't care about your zero tolerance stuff. We know what was going on. We have a video because someone was using a cell phone. And we're like, this kid's so fine. He laid hands on, but what was he laying hands on for? He was laying hands because it was necessary to protect someone who was lesser able to defend themselves. We said, if anything, this kid should be made the president of the school. This kid's a model citizen. And so, those are the kinds of things that I live for, is to see, society step up, and like kind of answers or goes into the second part of your question is, what can we do? Well, we call it out when we see it, just like racism. If we see it, we call it out. We don't allow it to go on. If we have to, we insert ourselves between the abuse and thereof, and do what we can to just call attention to it. And, but mostly I would say show love and compassion and caring and consideration, because this is a marginalized group of people who still continue to be marginalized. And the reason most of them are marginalized is because able-bodied people feel very, very, very uncomfortable when they see someone who's different, or they don't know how to interact. It's like, what do I do? Avoid, run away, flight or fight response, don't deal with it. And it's like, I say, deal with it. Go up and talk to them. What's the worst that they do? Look at you and say, no, I don't want any part of you, like Zem was going after. Okay, fine. If they do that, oh well, move on. Life is what it is. I hope that answered your questions.
Yes, thank you so much.
I'd like to hear from Mick, because he's on the ground with students with special needs. I want to hear some of your perspective, if you don't mind me putting you on the spot.
Yeah, so I was listening. I just came in about 5 minutes ago, and everything Jeremy said is spot on. It might be worth noting, by the way, that that thing that he was talking about with the IEP and all the hassle with the paperwork, that is totally true. I mean, it's a royal pain in the ass to fill in all that stuff. But there's another piece to that that's important to think about. And it's something that a lot of people don't really talk about, but the IEP process itself has a long kind of history with a disproportionate amount of students of color being identified. And what I mean by that is specifically a lot of Black families correctly point to the statistics that show that Black kids are disproportionately filling these classes and getting special ed services, and they're identified with IEPs and all that. So speaking with some educators recently, and really an idea is, even though it's a pain in the butt, it should be a streamlined process, but one really that we do for every single student, from the general population just as much as we would for students with special needs. And in that way, what we're doing is the IEP itself becomes a standard plan. Frankly, every single kid does need an IEP. I don't mean just kids with special needs. I mean kids with who may not necessarily qualify for special ed services, but they have special needs nonetheless. And in some cases, it's where the special services may in fact be curriculum or programming that addresses their needs as in terms of depth and complexity. So if you're talking about some Einstein kid, that kid's going to need some special services that cater to whatever that kid needs in the class. And to be clear, most kids are not like Einsteins in everything. They're good at one thing or two things. They're really, really good at that. And that's why an IEP totally makes sense for, to be specific about what that kid's needs are, because it becomes individualized anyways. So it is a royal hassle. The paperwork is totally no fun. I have less of an issue with the paperwork itself and the idea that we would identify students than I do that the paperwork needs to be quite as complex as it is. And I know that some of that is around compliance, but it truly needs to be streamlined. And I'm sure you've heard that before, Jeremy.
Oh, very much so, Mick. I mean, and one of the things that's great that you brought up, not only should it be for every child, but they also put IEPs together for the gifted ones, for mentally gifted minors, or whatever we call it today. Yeah, they put it together. It should be for every child. And I found that the streamlining of it, I was able to actually see some of that toward the end of my career when we started putting it on computers. At first, when I started, it was all written by hand. And, to write that up for 15 or 16 kids, and then that has to be done with every single special needs kid, it was intense. And then when we started computerizing it, it got easier in that we could cut and paste, but it's still a lot of legality, a lot of paperwork. And what I'd be interested in, a question for you, Mick, is when you say streamlining, how do you think we could actually streamline that paperwork and also make it inclusive for the entire educational population?
Well, I am, to be fair, first of all, I'm not in the classroom anymore. So it's been a number of years. I'm a resource teacher at the central offices. And then also, to be more transparent yet, I also haven't had, I haven't been in the system for special ed. I work with the general ed population for many, many years. And I did work with a lot of gifted and kids that were, identified on the gate kind of scale. But even for that, by the way, that also has implications for some of the racist structures that exist within our school system. And I think just in terms of where I was working, the kids that were identified as gays, every single one of them was a student of color. But it doesn't necessarily play out that way across the school district. And I think it's important to think about what I said with if we were to take the general population and apply a streamlined version of all that paperwork, instead of having 4 or 5 pages, which is what it typically was, if we could get it down to 2 pages, that would be fantastic. And I think that it's all doable. Every kid does. It's like I said, every kid does have special accommodations that they need. You don't need to have a 504 or an IEP to need special accommodations. So I don't know if I have a great answer for that, but I think that there's a lot of stuff that's on that paperwork that, for the sake of checking something off, they've made a special box, and they've made it so that you fill in your cutting and pasting, like you said. But it would seem like a lot of that stuff is you're replicating much of the same thing in the same in a lot of those different boxes. So to make it let's make it so that you're not having to be redundant. That's about what I would say.
Well, thank you so much for your insight, because I agree with you. I mean, one of the things I've found that these IEPs have on them is so much, not just redundancy, but legality that really doesn't need to be there. It can be on a separate attached sheet that doesn't even have to be filled out by the educator or by the family. It can just be kind of, shoved over onto the side, because the school districts are so notorious for wanting to protect themselves. And so there's a lot of game. And I see Erin had put in that she's a research teacher in elementary, and you can't get an IEP down to 2 to 4 pages. The legalities are there for the students' protection. Yes, they are, but they're also there for the school district's protection. And that's the part that's really sad, because that's one thing I've done in retirement is when school districts choose not to comply, not to provide the reasonable accommodations, oftentimes it's someone like me who goes and has a little talk with them and explains to them what happens if we come back and sue them. And how we use the full force of the legal system to basically make them cough up money necessary to give the kids. And so, Aaron, I see that you've unmuted yourself. Do you want to
Yes.
make a comment? Go for it.
Yeah, I don't think the legalities are there for the school district's protection. They're there to hold the school district accountable to that student who has many legal rights. And so I'm doing the legal pages that the student is entitled to. I have to clarify present levels. I've got to base goals off those present levels. I base services off those goals. And we discuss accommodations to make progress for those goals. Those are all legal parts of the IEP that it can't get down to 4 pages, but that's now a document that the school district is obligated to follow through on to protect the student and meet that student's needs.
Have you found that you're in IEP meetings? I take it as, of
yeah.
course, as a resource
Yeah.
specialist. And so when you're in those meetings, how often or how frequent now do you find that parents come in with a lawyer or two in tow?
I have a lawyer about one every year. It's pretty rare, maybe not even that often. And those meetings are more contentious and can be a little anxiety provoking. But for the most part, the parents are very appreciative of the help their student is getting, and they see the progress they're making. So most meetings go very smoothly, and there's no advocate and no lawyer.
Very good.
And I live in a high profile district at my school where many of the parents have money for these things, but still, I think that just making sure you have open communication with the parent all along the way so that you stay on the same side, you stay on the same team, and they're informed, they understand your process, and they understand their child is getting what they need. If you kind of don't communicate with parents, they might come to their own conclusions and misunderstand things.
Is this by any chance the Irvine Unified?
Tustin Unified.
Tustin Unified. Okay.
Yeah.
Very close. I'm familiar with all these school districts because I've dealt with all of them. Oh yeah, in various forms over the years. And what I found is, because when I started doing this back in the early 90s, when I first started, actually designing the IEPs and implementing it legally, was that a lot of school districts were, in an IEP meeting, they were actually trying to tell the parents, oh, well, we know what's best for your kid. We're the ones that are here. And they were avoiding providing certain accommodations because they were getting the parents to give into it. And so that's why I'm glad to hear that now, 30 years later in 2021, it sounds more like that the IEPs have been designed really more to help the children and not give the school district any room to wiggle out from under.
Right.
Very good. So anybody else have any other questions or comments that they'd like to make? DLJ just put something in. Do the same rules apply to both public and private school services? Yes, they're supposed to, but oftentimes, DLJ, they don't. And the reason why is because private schools oftentimes don't have to teach to the same standards. And also because private schools tend to have more money, they tend to acquiesce easier to the needs because they know, it's nasty for me to say, but people who have money know how to take care of themselves because they know how to get the assistance they need from the legal representative before they even walk in the meeting. So a lot of times private schools are already providing those services because they have the funding to do so, and the parents also provide the funding. So the public schools, oftentimes, they're just mandated legally. They have to. Whereas the private schools are supposed to, but oftentimes there's really no law that says you have to do it, just like separation of church and state. A Catholic school can teach religion, because it's a private institution. It's not bound by the same laws. Go for it, Mike.
Okay, well, similar question. Are homeschooled kids and kids to go to charter schools, is that the same as the private schools we were just discussing? But are their needs being met, special ed kids, or are they avoiding, charter schools not taking special ed kids? And, what's the fate of a homeschooled family that's been doing it for a few years, and then all of a sudden they have a new family member that with special ed needs? Are those needs met, without being involved in public schools? It almost seems like if you're not in the public schools, you're likely going to be, left out.
Excellent question, Mike. And as far as charter schools do have to provide them if the charter school is run by a public school district. If it is not, if it's run by a private group, then no, it doesn't, because it's then technically a private school. And as far as homeschooling is concerned, a lot of it has to do with, do the parents actually reveal what is going on in the house? Because what goes on with homeschooling is the parent has to apply to the state of California to get a homeschooling permit. Then they have to provide the state of California Department of Education a approved curriculum. And if they provide that approved curriculum and they show that they have the permit, and the permit means that they have the ability to actually know how to teach the student at the appropriate developmental level that the student is at, then they do get to teach the student. But the big thing is do they reveal that the student has special needs? Do they reveal certain things? And that's the part I really can't answer, because I don't know. I don't know what goes on in the private home. All I know is that on the state level, they have to provide a curriculum. They have to provide proof that they can teach that curriculum and that that curriculum is developmentally appropriate for that child. As far as whether they're dealing with disabilities or not, I couldn't tell you, because there's not enough research. There's not enough of the window into the house to tell us what's really going on.
Well, thank you.
Okay.
All right, so I have a comment followed by a question. It's more of a broader based question. So you yourself are a social psychologist specializing in people with special needs, and you yourself have special needs, or had special needs prior to a certain surgery you had to correct epilepsy. There is a psychiatrist whose name is Dr. John Holloway, MD. He has ADD, and he's written a number of books about it. And I'd like to read a short passage, then lead into a particular question about the far-reaching aspects of special needs in society. In his book, Delivered from Distraction, Dr. Holloway writes, "So let me describe ADD from my point of view. First of all, I resent the term. Maybe it's just because I have ADD myself, but it seems to me that if anyone has a disorder, it is the people who plod along, paying close attention to every little speck and crumb, every little detail and rule, every minor policy and procedure, and every minuscule manual. I think these are the people that have a disorder. I call it attention surplus disorder. They did exactly what they were told as children, told on others who did not, and now make a living doing what they're told, telling others what to do and telling on those who don't. What kind of life is that? Wouldn't you rather have attention deficit than attention surplus? If you had to call one a disorder, wouldn't you vote for the surplus? Who wants to pay attention to the myriad of details for very long? Is it really a sign of mental health to be able to balance your checkbook, sit in your chair and never speak out of turn? As far as I can see, many people who don't have ADD are charter members of the Society of the Congenitally Boring. And who do you suppose advanced civilization? Who do you suppose comes up with the new ideas today? People with ADD, of course. And one other peripheral comment, I think it was really interesting. I think it was really interesting that a couple of weeks ago, or it was last week rather, Elon Musk of Tesla was on Saturday Night Live, and he made a point to say that he was the first person openly living with Asperger's who was hosting Saturday Night Live, and he says, you know, sometimes I might tweet odd things, but do you think someone who's reinventing electric cars and placing people on Mars is going to act like a normal dude? So thinking about what Dr. Holloway said and thinking about Elon Musk, and keeping in mind that 1/7 of people who have special needs are mobility centered. I'm talking about people who have difficult times taking care of themselves, people who have certain cognitive issues that emotional pathology might fall under. How much does our society contribute to people who would otherwise be considered as having special needs? How essentially how sick is our society, and how with the alienation, with the constant pressures? For example, we can look at Europe and places like Germany, where if you are experiencing depression, you get paid to go to a spa for a month, and then in Europe you're supposed to take August and another month off. And in Europe, leisure is considered a right. And in the United States, we just talked about this last night at Coffee and Conversation. 47,000 people died last year. Oh, sorry, 740,000. Sorry, 740,000 people across the globe died last year from overwork. Thank you, Michelle, for placing that in the Slack. Looking at this with the alienation, our drive to be compulsively focused, compulsively overworked, et cetera, how much does our society and its unrealistic expectations contribute to people who have special needs? How much is it the society versus the individual that's responsible for being considered having special needs, or through constant abuse, constant alienation, constant pressures that moral probity is evidenced by material success? How much of this contributes to producing individuals with special needs, society itself?
Well, I could give you the flippant answer and go asked and answered, but and I say that because I kind of alluded to it when I gave my own story and when I talked about how, you know, social attitudes affect social competency. I'm convinced with everything you just said and from the research and the experiences that I've had, not only personally, but professionally, that we are making society sick. It is not that there are people who have differences or are differently able-bodied or differently, you know, abled, that we are putting too much emphasis on difference and calling attention to those issues, that we're making our own society physically and emotionally ill. I love the fact that, you know, Elon Musk came out with that because, yeah, Elon Musk has, you can tell he has Asperger's. He doesn't emotionally connect with people. He doesn't identify. Well, why do you think he's kept it secret for so long? Because he knew if he brought it out, the stigma of society would make it worse. They would blow it out of proportion. How can someone with this disability be capable or able to do this? This is a fluke. This is an aberration. We need to ostracize him or make him, put him on a pedestal or do something to him. I mean, just recently, Google has started figuring out that people with autism are brilliant at working for them because they can focus in on very specific information. And therefore, Google has actually determined, well, these people need a special kind of break room. And what it is it's a nap room. And you experienced this yourself, Jason. You went into one of them in which, you know, they have lounging chairs in the dark where you can go take a nap. And, you know, are we in kindergarten? No, we're accommodating the needs of people who have a specific need that helps them to function better. And so instead of, as the word I used before, stigmatizing and making them wrong, bad, different, inclusion would be better. And so I'm convinced from what you were saying and the article you read, Jason, that the fact is that we as a society, especially here in America, we are making people sick because we have created an artificial construct, an artificially social construct that you have to work to be productive, you have to produce this much per day, per hour, per week, whatever. And that if you don't, you're not living up to a certain standard, and then there's something wrong with you. Instead of just each individual is who they are, this is what they're capable of, and have full inclusion and acceptance. So I really do believe that we as a society have made hypercritical problems where there really don't need to be them.
Yeah, and for those who are watching on the video later, and for new people, we have a current events discussion group every Saturday night. And last night, the topic that sparked the most passionate responses and the widest depth of conversation was the 10 schools in the University of California system are no longer going to be requiring the SAT or ACT for admission. And it's because they have non-discrimination policies that the court case there was a court case on this, and a study was brought up, and it was through the APA, and it demonstrated the results of the study demonstrated by looking at four sets of experiments on race and cognitive ability, or being informed of race before cognitive ability, such as Black kids aren't that good at math, Asians are better at math. What they determined through the controls in that experiment, it's that just being informed that people of your racial demographic are inferior at mathematics. It doesn't matter if the test was actually testing for cognitive salience with success in the results of the test. Just being aware of this cultural expectation that if you're Asian, you're better at math. If you're Black, you're worse at math. It just automatically dropped the scores because it lowered the confidence of certain students. And so my thought along the lines of society really being the sick one here. The fact of the matter is, we have the tyranny of metrics at hand in the school system. And at the same time, looking at this, some of our social attitudes are prevalent social and prevailing social attitudes undoubtedly seem to push people into the category of people with special needs, because they have a special need for a fair, just, and equitable society.
Well, and building on what you said, Jason, the thing that's absolutely appalling, and this started as far back as the 50s, that's when I can earliestly remember it, was children, especially boys, who were hyperactive, or I shouldn't say who were hyperactive, who were energetic, were diagnosed as, hyperactive, then eventually ADHD. It was made into a disorder. And what was the answer? Let's give them all Ritalin. Let's just medicate them. And this was insane, because what are we doing? We're supporting pharmaceutical companies at the tunes of thousands of dollars, and we're misdiagnosing and mismedicating people because there really was no diagnosis necessary. Little boys are energetic. This is what happens when you have testosterone and you don't know what to do with it. I mean, I used to watch kindergartners at the end of recess. These little boys would run in circles around the playground, like run laps, because they were still full of so much energy. They just needed to get it out of them. And I would tell them, go run, get rid of it, because once you're in here again, you need to be able to sit down and focus. And so, it's not that they're hyperactive. They just have a lot of energy that they don't know what to do with. This is not an abnormal, and it's like you're saying, we're going to label this abnormal, we're going to diagnose this, we're going to medicate it, and we're going to try to make something out of it instead of just, okay, little boys are energetic, accept it. Sometimes little girls are energetic. We call them tomboys. It's just part of life. It's not a bad thing. So I think we've done a lot of bad things when it comes to diagnosis and labeling that really doesn't need to be done. And also, like you said, instead of really looking at, instead of wanting to put not just a label on it, an identifier, but just to be accepting and inclusive. And I think we've made more out of it. And I think we've pushed more people into being labeled disabled than are necessary. I think we have a lot of people in our society in the homeless problem that have certain mental problems, but these mental problems are based on chemical disorders, chemical imbalances in their brain. And if it can't be treated with medication, maybe it can be treated some other way, but we don't want to just put an identifier on them and a label that says, oh, there's something wrong with you, therefore we have to label you and make you bad.
So do we have any final questions? We're now at 3 o'clock. Any final questions as we wrap up the day?
I did want to comment on something that Andreas put in the chat. Greta Thunberg calls her autism a superpower. Greta Thunberg is my hope for the future. She's my hero, because any child who can stand up with autism in front of the United Nations, point at them and tell them they're a bunch of screw ups, she's my hero.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. This was.
I would add, well, I wanted to add something, and I totally agree with you, Jeremy. She's a hero of mine as well. I think there's a lot of kids, though, a lot of people in the general population who go undiagnosed, but then some people that are diagnosed may struggle with some type of ability that means they're not able to express themselves in the way that Greta Thunberg does. And I think they have the ability to process things, and they have the ability to craft their ideas, but not necessarily verbally in the way that she does. She clearly has a really strong gift for verbally expressing and articulating her ideas. I just think that a lot of the work that needs to happen is to give our students those opportunities to express themselves and show agency and take the power that they already have. They already have the power. It's just a matter of removing barriers from them so that they can fully articulate it in the best way that they can. And that's not always verbally. Sometimes it's, with art, or they do it through mathematics or whatever they find is their passion. I think a lot of the work of our teachers, regardless of its whether with special ed circumstances or just a part of the general population, the big piece is to figure out where our students' strengths are and let them, kind of like blossom from there. And one other thought I had was just here at a local level in San Diego, we have a department called TRACE. And to be fair, I don't recall what the acronym stands for, but TRACE is a transitional youth age group. So they work with kids between the age of 18 to 23, and they're youth. They're not kids, but they're youth, and these are students with a whole lot of them do have some form of disability. And there's a teacher that has created an extracurricular group that meets, I think, once a month. I'm not sure. During the quarantine, this has been very difficult to do any kinds of group work. But she's been meeting with them, and they've created a team that's like a social justice league of all things. Speaking of superpowers, but these kids are really advocating. They're self-advocating and talking about what the school district and what society in general needs to do in order to remove those hurdles and to build that type of agency so that our kids fully realize what their powers are. And I'll end with that. Thank you.
You're so right, Mick. What their full potential is. And what I want to do as a parting thought from me to all of you, especially those of you that teach or in a classroom, whether it's a regular ed or a special ed or a GATE classroom, is a couple of things I used to put up on the walls. Was one sign that said, learned helplessness is not acceptable in this classroom. And I would explain to them what learned helplessness was. So this is not going to be accepted. And the other thing I always put up too on a bright yellow poster was quitting is not an option. And I always reinforce that no matter who you are, giving up doesn't work. You know, relying on manipulation as far as, oh, I'm disabled or whatever, doesn't work. It's like, hold your own, do what you can. We're here to help, and you know, we'll help you get through it, whatever it is.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. Thank you, Jeremy, and we look forward to seeing you this upcoming week and next week when we celebrate Humanist in Foxholes.